The moment Prince Harry stepped off the plane at Heathrow, the world seemed to hold its breath. Not because of his return, but because of what he was returning for. A courtroom. The Supreme Court. London was gray that day, the clouds low and heavy, almost mirroring the tension in the air. You could feel it, even from afar. A man who had spent years shielding himself from prying eyes had voluntarily walked back into the eye of the storm. Why? Why now? The question hung like a weight, unanswered, almost mocking in its persistence. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. He was here for the final chapter of his privacy war, a legal battle that had dragged on for years. The newspapers had hunted him, tracked him, published stories he insisted were false, invasive, and damaging. He had fought in courts before, yes, but this, the highest court in the land, was different. Stakes higher, eyes sharper, scrutiny more intense. And yet, there was something else, something unexpected, lurking in the shadows of this trial. Something personal, something private, or at least it had been. Until now. During the trial, a casual line, almost offhand, slipped out. One sentence, one small moment of testimony, and suddenly, the story wasn't just about tabloids and privacy. It was about a woman, someone from Harry's past, someone who had long tried to stay out of the glare. Chelsy Davy. For anyone who followed the royal news, or even the gossip columns, Chelsy Davy was known. She had been a private figure, a distant memory for most, a name mentioned occasionally in retrospectives about Harry's early life. But Harry's words changed that. In one moment, Chelsy went from quiet anonymity to headline material. The court wasn't just a legal stage anymore. It had become a place where reputations were tested and privacy became a weapon of its own making. It raises a question. Can someone who fights so fiercely for privacy ever fully control the consequences of their own words? When a public figure speaks, even in a courtroom meant to protect them, how much can they predict the fallout? And when the fallout lands on someone else, someone who never asked to be in the spotlight, what then? Chelsy Davy's life shifted that day, not gradually, not slowly, but instantly. Overnight, the tabloids were alive with speculation. Who was the early girlfriend Harry referred to? What had paid off by tabloids mean? The phrasing, innocuous to some, devastating to others. Within hours, social media and press alike identified Chelsy. Headlines splashed her name. Images from years past resurfaced. Old photos that had been carefully archived and tucked away became evidence of a life she had tried to live quietly. It is important to pause here and consider the irony. Harry has spent years trying to shield himself from intrusive coverage. He has gone to court, argued legal precedent, and demanded accountability from the press. And yet, in the very courtroom meant to protect him, his words, intended to illustrate a broader pattern of media manipulation, ended up exposing someone else to the glare he has always sought to avoid. A lesson in unintended consequences, perhaps, or maybe a reminder that even privacy has fragile boundaries when power and fame collide. For Chelsy, the implications were immediate and intense. Her reputation, carefully maintained, suddenly teetered. Old acquaintances, journalists, even casual social media users began to dissect every known detail of her life. Every appearance, every public moment, every previously private anecdote became a potential piece of the puzzle. And she had no control over it. No way to stop it. The very system Harry had challenged for his own protection had now been weaponized, indirectly, against her. This is where the stakes expand beyond celebrity gossip. There's a legal dimension that can't be ignored. Chelsy Davy isn't just facing public scrutiny. She is taking legal action. Libel, defamation, reputational damage. These aren't just words tossed into the ether. They carry consequences that can shape livelihoods, professional opportunities, and personal dignity. She is dragging one of the most recognizable men in the world into court, seeking accountability for harm done to her name. And in doing so, she raises questions that ripple outward. How far does responsibility extend when someone speaks in a courtroom? When does a statement cross the line from illustrative to harmful? How do courts balance the right to protect oneself with the right of another to remain untouched by public speculation? And there's a human story here too, a deeply emotional one. Chelsy Davy is not just a figure in a legal battle. She is a person who had a relationship a history, memories, a connection to Harry. That connection, once private and intimate, is now under examination in front of strangers, reporters, and cameras. Her life, her choices, her identity, all subtly reframed through the lens of Harry's testimony and the media's interpretation of it. The emotional stakes are real: betrayal, humiliation, anxiety. Imagine being reminded, publicly, of a relationship you once held close, only to have the narrative twisted in a courtroom by someone you once trusted. How do you protect yourself from that? At the same time, this story taps into something universal. Even without the fame, most people understand the vulnerability of having private moments exposed. We've all had conversations taken out of context, messages misinterpreted, moments of trust violated. The scale here is massive, yes, global. But the emotional resonance is familiar. It's the fear of being misunderstood, the anxiety that something personal might be misrepresented in a way that damages not just reputation but self-worth. But let's not rush to judgment, either. There is nuance here, and that's what makes it compelling. Harry's testimony wasn't meant to harm Chelsy personally. He was recounting an example to support his case against the tabloids. His goal was to illustrate how pervasive and damaging media intrusion can be, how even those who think they are untouchable can be manipulated and exploited. Yet, the courtroom is not a vacuum. Words matter. Context is often lost once they leave the witness stand. And once the media seizes a narrative, nuance rarely survives. Now, consider the tension this creates. On one hand, a man seeking justice for himself. On the other, a woman pulled into the crossfire, her own life suddenly scrutinized and debated. The layers of irony, the emotional contradictions, are almost Shakespearean. And they raise a tantalizing question: what happens next? How does someone like Chelsy respond when the person responsible for her exposure is not a stranger, but a former lover, someone intimately familiar with the power of words and their consequences? It is in this space, between private life and public spectacle, between justice and unintended harm, that the drama unfolds. And it is why this story matters now, not historically. The Supreme Court sessions are current, unfolding in real time, with potential reverberations for privacy law, media accountability, and public discourse. We are watching the consequences of actions, legal and personal, collide. And the outcome is anything but certain. For the audience, the intrigue is immediate. You feel it. The tension of a courtroom, the unpredictability of human behavior, the potential for scandal or vindication. You wonder, will Chelsy succeed in her lawsuit? Will Harry's intentions be understood, or will he face backlash for what many perceive as carelessness? What does this mean for the broader narrative of privacy, fame, and accountability? The questions are pressing, and the answers are far from simple. And yet, as the cameras rolled and the journalists scribbled, another dimension remained unspoken. The personal cost, the emotional fallout, the hidden strategies behind closed doors. These elements would define the next chapters of this story. Not just what is said in court, but how it ripples through lives, relationships, and the public imagination. It's the quiet, almost invisible tension that often carries the most weight. The moment when a single statement changes everything, quietly, inexorably, and with consequences no one could fully anticipate. And so, as Prince Harry took his place in the courtroom, as Chelsy Davy prepared to fight back, and as the world watched, the story was no longer just about tabloids or legal precedent. It was about human vulnerability, unintended consequences, and the collision of personal history with global scrutiny. The stage was set. The pieces were in motion. And the first move had already been made. Why would Prince Harry, a man who fled the UK spotlight to protect himself and his family, voluntarily return? That question lingered over London like the low winter clouds on the morning of his arrival. The city felt charged, almost electric, as if everyone knew something was about to happen, but none of us could fully anticipate what. Airports were buzzing, reporters swarming, cameras flashing, and yet the man at the center of it all moved with an almost careful detachment. Every step calculated, every gesture precise. Yet the tension clung to him as visibly as the damp cold in the air. Harry's return wasn't for a casual appearance, a charity gala, or a royal engagement. He was there for the Supreme Court, the United Kingdom's highest tribunal, where law and precedent intersect in ways few outside legal circles ever witness. It was the culmination of years-long privacy battles, a fight against tabloid newspapers that had, in his words, exploited my life and sought to profit from pain. Yet this battle was different from the rest. This time, the stakes were personal in ways no headline could capture. There was a narrative that had been building for weeks, months, even years, but it became impossible to ignore. Legal analysts, court reporters, and even casual onlookers were all asking the same question. What would Harry say this time? And more importantly, who might his words impact beyond the courtroom walls? This question became almost prophetic once he began speaking. One line, one passing remark, and the entire story shifted from tabloid pursuit to personal accountability. He referred to an early girlfriend, an unnamed woman, claiming she had been paid off by tabloids. The remark, intended as an illustrative point about media intrusion, had immediate consequences. Within hours, readers, social media users, and journalists connected the dots, identifying Chelsy Davy as the woman in question. Her name, once private, now carried weight, implication, and controversy. And the reverberations were only beginning. The irony here was palpable. Harry had dedicated himself to protecting privacy, his own and, ostensibly, the privacy of those close to him. Yet in one casual courtroom observation, he had inadvertently exposed someone he once cared for. The tension between intent and consequence was striking, almost cruel. And for Chelsy, the fallout was instant, visible, and unavoidable. Before this, Chelsy's life had been quiet. She had managed to navigate fame's shadow with a degree of discretion rare in the celebrity world. She attended events selectively, appeared in media sparingly, and largely avoided commentary on her relationship with Harry or any other high-profile figure. But the courtroom testimony removed that buffer. Overnight, the tabloids revisited old stories, photographs resurfaced from decades past, and speculation ran rampant. Old friends and colleagues were questioned, online forums dissected her past, and Chelsy became, involuntarily, the central figure in a legal narrative that was not hers alone to tell. London itself seemed to respond to the drama. The streets around the Supreme Court were lined with journalists, cameras trained on entrances, microphones poised for sound bites, reporters chasing every conceivable angle. Pedestrians and passers-by felt the tension even if they didn't know the details. There was something in the air, an anticipation that something major was about to unfold. For a man like Harry, who had spent years dodging precisely this kind of attention, stepping back into it was bold, audacious, risky, and yet he did it. Why? Some say it was about principle, others about legacy. Perhaps it was a combination, a determination to set the record straight, to demand accountability from media outlets he viewed as exploitative. The courtroom had become more than a legal forum. It was now a stage for testing boundaries between fame, privacy, and personal responsibility. But here's the question for you, the viewer. When someone like Harry takes the stand, when a person with such a global profile speaks, how much of what they say remains their own? How much becomes public property the moment it leaves the witness box? And perhaps more importantly, how much unintended damage can it cause? Because as we would soon learn, one remark could set in motion events that no one could control. Back in the courtroom, the air was taut with anticipation. Legal clerks moved efficiently, judges sat in silence, and attorneys whispered strategy to one another in hushed tones. The cameras, which are usually kept discreet in the UK Supreme Court, were everywhere, reflecting, capturing, and documenting. Every gesture, every pause, every sigh would be dissected later across newspapers, social media, and commentary shows. And in the midst of it all, Harry began to speak. The testimony itself was calm, precise, and methodical. He recounted incidents of tabloid intrusion, outlined patterns of harassment, and explained his perspective on media behavior in his life. But then, almost casually, he referenced a girlfriend from his past, alleging she had been influenced, paid off, by media outlets. The intent was clear, to illustrate how pervasive and insidious media manipulation could be. But what he hadn't accounted for was the immediacy with which this information would spread, and the way it would hit someone who had no preparation for public scrutiny. Chelsy Davy, suddenly, was not just a name in Harry's past. She was a public figure again, an unintended participant in a global legal spectacle. And in the hours that followed, her name was everywhere. Headlines splashed across newspapers, online articles dissected her every public appearance, and social media erupted with speculation. People connected dots that may or may not have existed. Assumptions were made. Questions were asked. Judgments formed. The tension here is fascinating because it's about control, or the illusion of it. Harry was attempting to reclaim control over his narrative, over the portrayal of his private life, over the actions of tabloids. And yet, in attempting to assert control, he inadvertently shifted the spotlight onto someone else. It raises a fundamental question about fame, privacy, and responsibility. Can someone with global recognition ever truly speak freely without impacting others in unforeseen ways? The answer, as this case demonstrates, is complicated. What makes the story even more compelling is Chelsy's response. She did not remain silent. Nor did she simply accept the unintended exposure as an unfortunate byproduct of Harry's legal fight. She made a choice, one that would bring her back into the headlines in a way she likely never anticipated. Chelsy decided to sue. A libel lawsuit, claiming reputational damage, seeking legal accountability. And in doing so, she forced a reckoning not just with Harry's words, but with the broader dynamics of power, fame, and media influence. At this point, the narrative expands beyond celebrity drama. It touches on fundamental questions of ethics, law, and human decency. When words are spoken in a courtroom, they carry weight. And when those words implicate someone in a public and damaging way,